Speaker, I rise to state the Scottish National Party's unequivocal support for this application and to congratulate the Right Honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield in achieving this debate. Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous speaker, unlike the honourable lady who spoke previously, I'm going to confine myself to the terms of the motion. But I would just gently wish to remind her that this motion is supported from members across the House, some of whom, like her, have constituencies who voted leave, and some of whom, like me, have constituencies which voted remain. And when we talk of the will of the people in Scotland, the will of the people in Scotland is to remain. And so I have no shame in having that as my primary motivation. But having said that, I'm also very concerned that this Parliament and this government, for so long as I and my colleagues are here, that things are done properly. And there's very strong grounds for suspicion that things have not been done properly in relation to this prorogation. Because, Mr. Speaker, the dogs in the street know that the reason this Prime Minister is proroguing Parliament is to avoid scrutiny as he hurtles towards the 31st of October and a no-deal Brexit. And really, nobody is fooled that the prorogation has anything to do with the need to commence a new session and to have a Queen's speech on pressing domestic bills, which none of us have seen so far. And if the litigation in which I and others in this House are involved in Scotland has achieved nothing else, it will have shown that something is very much awry with the reasons given for the prorogation. Because as I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I agree with what she says, and in so many ways I think were we able to have a voice on this, many members of this House would think we shouldn't even have conference recess for 3 weeks, and actually Parliament should be here doing its job at a time of crisis, speaking on behalf of our communities.
I entirely agree with the honourable lady on that matter. But, Mr. Speaker, the documents lodged with the Scottish Court last week and revealed to the public, against the government's wishes but as a result of interventions by the legal team which I and others in this House instruct, and by the BBC and other newspapers, they reveal that the Prime Minister had approved a plan to prorogue Parliament on the 16th of August. Yet, as the Right Honourable and learned gentleman said in his opening speech, as late as the 25th of August, a Number 10 spokesperson was still denying that there was any such plan to prorogue. And indeed, in the pleadings lodged by the government in response to the action raised in Scotland by myself and other members of this House, the British government referred to our contention that we were in fear of a prorogation as hypothetical and academic. So there are very real reasons to believe that this government is economical with the truth. And the memos produced by the British government not only showed the somewhat distasteful comment about girly swats, with which I think the Right Honourable and learned gentleman dealt with most ably earlier, but they also showed that the reason that the current Prime Minister wants to prorogue this Parliament is because he wants to avoid what he referred to as the rigmarole of this Parliament sitting in September. So if the Scottish case achieves nothing else, it has shown that the government hasn't been entirely truthful so far. And another myth that was finally put to rest at the weekend occurred when the Right Honourable Member for Hastings and Rye resigned, because most of us were not surprised to hear her confirm that there are in fact no negotiations ongoing at present with the European Union. Now, of course, we already knew that from the former Chancellor of the Exchequer and also from a number of counterparts in the European Union. And I noted last week at the Brexit Select Committee, the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster initially tried to give the impression that negotiations were ongoing, but when pressed on the matter, he conceded that there are no negotiations as such, merely discussions. So we heard that from the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster last week, but it was good, Mr. Speaker, to hear it from someone who has so recently been at the heart of government and has had the decency to leave the government, given what she's seen. And, Mr Speaker, the weight of evidence regarding the damage that no deal would do to the nations of these islands is overwhelming, and we all know that from the work we've done in select committees over the last few years, work which won't be happening over the next few weeks when Parliament is prorogued. But still, Mr Speaker, the Government won't tell us the truth about the assessment they've made of the impact of a no-deal Brexit and the preparations they're making for that. So it's quite right that this House seek the documentation relating to Operation Yellowhammer. But I want to concentrate on the prorogation case, because myself and a number of other MPs and peers and Joe Mon QC and the Good Law Project have raised an action in Scotland in which we argue that Parliament is being prorogued for an unlawful purpose and there to prevent democratic scrutiny, and that therefore the court should overturn the order to prorogue. And although the judge at first instance wasn't with us, we had a full hearing before Scotland's appeal court last week, and we are awaiting the outcome of that decision on Wednesday of this week. And of course there's also been a date on the 17th of September assigned at the UK Supreme Court to hear any further appeal in the Scottish case, and also an appeal in the proceedings raised in England and Northern Ireland. And members of the public should be aware that if the courts eventually find out that the prorogation was unlawful, then they can order this Parliament to return. So even if we are prorogued tonight, all is not lost. But in the course of these proceedings, something rather curious happened last week. And I would commend to honourable members' attention a very interesting article written about this in the Financial Times at the weekend by David Allen Green, the distinguished legal commentator, entitled "The Curious Incident of the Missing Witness Statement." Because, Mr Speaker, in the Scottish case, the petitioners argue that the government had an improper motive in seeking the prorogation, and we say that the real intention was a cynical effort to close down Parliament so it couldn't block a no-deal Brexit. And usually there's a pretty straightforward way for the government or the responding party to rebut or refute an allegation of such bad faith. And if you're facing an allegation of bad faith like that, the normal thing to do in an action of judicial review would be to submit a sworn statement, an affidavit, setting out the way in which the decision was made, setting out that the decision was properly taken, and lodging relevant supportive documentation. But what happened last week in Edinburgh was that the government didn't provide any such witness statement, no such sworn affidavit, no official explanation, simply some documents heavily redacted without any covering explanation. And, Mr Speaker, the absence of such a statement in litigation such as this is, as David Allen Green says, very conspicuous.
Would she give way on that?
Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful for her giving way, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but from general knowledge, is what the government is doing here effectively the equivalent in American terms of taking the fifth, i.e. refusing to give evidence on the basis that it might incriminate them or cause them to commit perjury?
It does rather have the whiff of that. And at Prime Minister's questions last week, the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield asked the Prime Minister, as he said earlier, why it's proved impossible in the course of the Scottish legal proceedings to find any official of government or minister prepared to state on oath in a sworn statement the reasons for the prorogation. And as he said, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question. And as the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman went on to say, it has been suggested to a number of members of this House, myself included, by reliable sources, that officials of the government were approached by the Government Legal Service to swear such statements and refused to do so. Now, Mr Speaker, I can't know the reasons why they refused to sign a sworn statement. I can only speculate. And I speculate that perhaps they refused to sign a sworn statement for fear of perjuring themselves, or for fear that to tell the truth would be damaging to the government. Now, the idea, Mr Speaker, that any government official should be put in a position where they fear having to perjure themselves before the courts of either the jurisdictions of Scotland, England or any jurisdiction within this United Kingdom is very, very concerning. And the same sources that have suggested that officials have refused to sign sworn statements have also suggested to myself and other members of this House that what has been going on is that key figures in number 10 and the government have been communicating about the real reasons for prorogation, not through the official channels of government emails or government memos, but using personal emails, WhatsApp, and burner phones, which of course are phones that are normally used by people who are involved in a criminal enterprise in order to avoid being traced. Now, if this is true, they will have adopted a subterfuge. And there can really only be one reason for that subterfuge, and that would be to conceal the real reasons for prorogation from the scrutiny of this House and also, very seriously, from the scrutiny of the courts. Now, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman who presented this motion explained at some length what careful thought he's given to the way in which it's been presented, and so I'm not going to repeat any of that, other than to say that he has clearly applied his mind very carefully to it, and the allegations that underlie this motion are very, very serious. If there is no truth in them, then so be it. But let us pass the motion and let there be transparency and accountability, because transparency and accountability are, I suggest, Mr Speaker, the two things which this Prime Minister and his shabby administration fear the most.
Would she give way?
I will give way, yes.
She's making a very powerful case, and I just wondered if she would agree that the cavalier treatment by this government of parliamentary procedure and democratic principle really does underline the need not just for uncodified practices, but for a written constitution, and in particular for a citizens' assembly that could actually put the people at the heart of our democracy again.
Well, yes, I agree with my honourable friend, and I also take it further. The shabby practices of this government and the creaking of the British Constitution underline, in my mind, the need for my country to be independent of this mess. But, Mr Speaker, even as we've been speaking this afternoon, it's been reported on Twitter, as another honourable member alluded to, that number 10 sources, unidentified number 10 sources, are saying that even if we pass this humble address tonight, they're not going to comply with it. And,
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable and Learned Lady. Can I just very gently point out to her that as there is a significant number of other members waiting to contribute, and as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chancellor of the Duchy, has got every right and reasonable expectation to think that he will have 10 minutes or so to speak, I'm cautiously optimistic that the Honourable and Learned Lady is approaching her peroration. Joanna Cherry.
Mr Speaker, you're correct. I'm drawing to a close, and I was just going to say in relation to those unattributable briefings this afternoon. I'm more of a student of Scottish history than of English history, Mr Speaker, but our histories are bound together. And I know enough about English history to know that it was secret, unaccountable whispers of poison that brought down Edward II and Richard II. And I suspect this Prime Minister will be brought down by secret, unaccountable whispers of poison, such as that was briefed this afternoon as well. So let's make sure that this House and the courts see the contents of the secret whispers of poison that preceded this prorogation, so that we can all see the real reasons this House of Commons has been prorogued by an executive terrified of scrutiny. Yeah.